Welcome to On It, a podcast for people who crave inspiration to address what feels off in their sexual lives. I'm Lorina Manzanita, a somatic intimacy coach and trauma resolution practitioner. Join me and my brilliant colleagues as we explore ways for you to experience more pleasure and juicy intimacy that resonates with your soul. Hello and welcome to the podcast On It. I'm Lorina Manzanita, your host, and I'm a sex and relationship coach and trauma resolution practitioner, and today we're here with Annie Boheler. We are discussing how to avoid regret with sex, psychedelics, and consent. Annie Boheler works in the field of somatic and relational therapy as a coach and registered counselor. She identifies as a naturalist, holding a bachelor's degree in ecology, and has a foundation of eco-psychology in her practice. She works with individuals, couples, and groups around intimacy, sexual wellness, and psychedelic preparation and integration support. I'm also excited that I am co-creating with Annie. We are co-facilitating a peer supervision group called Contemplating Sex and Psychedelics. So this is totally in the zone of what we're up to together, and I'm glad we get to talk a bit about it more today. Although in this space, we're going to be speaking less to practitioners and more so to like everyday folks, practitioners included, but less in a professional context and more so in like situations and scenarios that apply to everyday people who might be interested in sex and psychedelics and how to avoid regret. Yeah. Annie, I am curious, what inspired you to like want to speak to this subject?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. I think about, some of the work that I've done, and in the moment of extreme challenge in my life, that if I wasn't doing some sort of work, like work meaning really addressing my body and something that could have been led to trauma and PTSD if left unaddressed, or deeply internalized regret, that I would be in a very different place in my life right now. And so I'm very grateful for whatever happened in my life to allow me access to that, and definitely want to support others from what I've learned.
Right. So it sounds like you've learned a bunch of tools, skills, ways of being with yourself that have kind of inoculated you in some ways from experiencing regret. At least maybe some regrets, but not like the full degree of a traumatic experience. And it seems like you're about to say something. Annie?
Yeah, and I think I just want to clarify, and we'll get into it, obviously. We're here to talk about regret. But, I feel like there can be different intensities around that. Like, are we ruminating about it? Do we feel like we have choice? Those sort of things.
Right. Yeah. Like, there's things that I'm like, I don't know if I don't necessarily want to do that again. And then there's, like, levels of, like, I wish I didn't do that. That's got like some more emotional impact and heaviness, and maybe there's some rumination to like, oh, that was really damaging and harmful. I don't wish that situation on anybody. Right. And then so hopefully what we discuss today helps people go to like the lighter end of that spectrum, not as if we can totally eliminate regret in our lives, especially as we explore expansive, deep, potent experiences that emerge in the context of psychedelics and sexuality.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm also curious if you feel like sharing that too, like around this, drawn to this topic.
So as a psychedelic assisted trauma work practitioner. I've experienced clients in their healing process try and do repair around wounds that involved sexuality and substances, traumatic experiences. And I just wanted to support people in not experiencing that. I think that's one element. And I also, just in terms of like the question of sexual integrity, I have my own personal ethos and ways of navigating sexuality and substances that I feel good about and feel solid about. And I would want to support people in feeling good and solid in their own selves, as so much curiosity and possibility surrounds medicine work and the use of psychedelics and substances like MDMA. We were talking earlier about empathogens, entheogens, like other substances that can have a way of dissolving or softening boundaries that might exist in our default consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that seems like a good place to start too. Like, okay, what are psychedelics? What is regret? And like kind of defining these things. There's the classic psychedelics, which are inherently boundary dissolving to some degree, mushrooms and LSD, and ayahuasca, classic psychedelics. And although MDMA is not a classic psychedelic, it also is boundary dissolving because of this direct connection with empathy and wanting to connect and these sort of things. So I think this can apply to not only psychedelics, but that cultural context we come from, where many people have a relationship or have at least been around alcohol to some degree, and where that's been normalized for some people, where it's more comfortable because inhibitions are loosened basically with the support of a substance. Yeah, and living in the Bay Area, California, there's more and more of these parties, gatherings that have this element of opportunities to engage with people in erotic or sexual ways, and also various substances from sassafras, 2CB. I forget exactly what that's called. There's a few.
Yeah, cannabis. So many different substances, and I think much of what we're going to be talking about applies to many of those substances. So you're saying, what is psychedelics? What is regret?
Yeah. And it makes me think of guilt. Like, I mean, there's some sort of closeness in the relationship with those energies, of those feelings, guilt and regret, I think. And as you were referencing your work, and I do similar work as well, I think about how someone could come into, maybe not even realizing they had regret before too. And it actually is like a part of this process of healing, and like, oh, I actually was in denial that I had regret. And now I'm seeing, because it's a connecting emotion.
A connecting emotion. Say more.
Like guilt is a connecting emotion. Like, I'm in a relationship with this person, and or at least yourself, like there's a relational aspect to it.
Ah, right.
As opposed to like shame, which might be a more isolated emotion. Like, I am a bad person, or
right. Although that can certainly also be relational, held in the space between two people, for sure.
And I think that's where like the ruminating comes in, where it's like, okay, we can be kind of caught in that. There isn't movement.
Right. And when I think about regret, it's often about the past, like what happened in the past. And there's this disempowering quality to it. There's a kind of a, both a resistance and lack of acceptance on some level of what happened in the past. And yeah, there's almost like, I think of rumination as a certain part of us is trying to like make the past be something other than it is, which is impossible. And then so it kind of lends us to live or like hang out in a state of disempowerment when it comes to regret. And you were saying earlier something about like the path to regret, out of regret is very much related to your ability to repair an experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were, kind of having a check-in discussion before we hit the record button, and the past couple of days thinking about this conversation. That's definitely something kind of on the tail end, and like something I've learned through my own experiences. That regret for me symbolizes learning. Like, oh, that's something I would have rather have done differently. Looking back on it, and through learning the repair process, repair is not always possible. But through learning, like I have access to a repair process exists. There's structures, there's other people who could support all these tools. Then that helps me. Oh, okay. Can I do something about this or can I not? Should I try to access the repair process or not? And if so, maybe there's a tool, and I think that helps me not ruminate on regret so much.
Right. It becomes more of a learning process, and there's a sense of like possibility of something different happening in the future, and also making peace with what happened in the past. And I'm getting the impression that when you talk about repairing with another person versus repairing, like making peace with yourself, or that, like sometimes I'll facilitate conversations with clients where like they're talking to their past selves. So there's a little bit of a repair in that process, but I'm getting that you're talking a bit more about repair in a like relational context. Is that what I was picking up on?
Yeah, that's what I was referring, but I think it could be applied to, our own selves, like you're saying too, that repair conversation with our past selves and bringing compassion in like that.
Right. Great. This is bringing me to the value of tuning into settings around using psychedelics. And who you're using psychedelics with, right? But before we go there, was there another piece that we wanted to discuss of just kind of like grounding in like some basic foundations? I think this can kind of like tune into consent as well, where I'm about to go to with the setting conversation.
I guess the only other thing, because we're these topics that are all kind of big topics, sex, psychedelics,
right,
and regret, is defining them. And so for me, thinking about sex, because sex is so many different things to so many different people and situational, that for me in this context, what comes up, not necessarily a definition, but thinking about sex as an escalation. That's what comes up for me, like an escalation in a relationship, something that's new, and because it could be something that one person defines as sex and someone else might not define as sex, but basically an intimacy or an escalation of some sort, and that's just what's coming up for me around the sex piece.
Yeah, when I think of sex, it's like I like to expand the understanding of what sex is. It's not necessarily just like penis and vagina intercourse acts, right? There's like varying degrees of arousal, varying degrees of intimacy, varying degrees of contact and play and exploration. And in terms of honoring boundaries in the realm of consent, and also avoiding regret, it's helpful to couch this conversation in a larger context of sexuality and eroticism and intimacy. So thank you for tagging that piece around sex and what is it, or at least expanding our understanding of what we're talking about. Escalation being a big piece of like the experience of sexuality that's shared amongst people. Yeah. Okay. So how does one avoid regret when it comes to sex and psychedelics? I think for me, like, it's helpful, and you were talking about escalation, like the more familiar variables one has in the particular setting of this experience, the more then you're less likely to avoid regret. If you're hanging out with somebody you know and love and have a strong familiarity and trust with, if you're using a substance at a particular dosage that you've got a lot of ground and understanding of, if dosage, context, the setting, people, like the more and more familiar you are with that, chances are there's going to be less regret involved in the situation. How does that land with you, Annie?
Yeah. Well, I agree. And, and it's funny because my science background comes in. I have a degree in science. And so I'm like, you want to isolate the variables.
Right.
And that way you can know if you want to repeat this experiment.
Love it. Yeah. I love orienting to creating intimate experiences when we're exploring new possibilities, like in an experimental manner. Like, I think one of the ways we can also create regret is having really strong attachments to how things should be or shouldn't be, or expectations, versus that attitude of experimentation has a certain level of wonder and curiosity involved. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing that in, because I do think so much of this has to do, and that's why I was bringing in the rumination piece too, because a lot of this does have to do with our socialization and like, hey, that maybe you don't want to repeat that experience. Does that mean it was bad? And if so, why? Like maybe the harm actually did happen. Or is it just, oh, that wasn't for you and now you learned? Right. Why is there regret? And I don't mean to say that in a way that's like not being empathetic, to folks who are experiencing that, but just to name like that attitude around going into a new experience definitely impacts, us on the other side.
Right. And then so like, when it comes to consent, I think it's really valuable to like slow things down and be intentional and use our words and have clarity of our agreements and expectations and like an accurate assessment of what's going on and what we're up to. And with psychedelics, much of the beauty of psychedelics and substances is kind of like expanding our capacities for more pleasure, for more connection beyond our familiar zones. And then so trying to find that just right balance between familiarity and something new. And that something new could be like substances. It could also be like what kind of sexual activities we might be up to, or who we might be engaging in those new sexual activities or those familiar sexual activities, but with a new person.
Right. And if we add on all these variables, like, oh, I'm going to go to this type of party, like a rave, and I've never been to a rave before, or whatever the environment is, and then I'm adding a substance, and then I'm adding a new person, and then I'm adding whatever else, it's hard to slow down when you've already added all these things. And then that piece around communication, if we haven't practiced that, like before, ingesting the substance or before going into a high stimulus environment, it's not super likely, at least from my experience, that like and maybe through the substances, because sometimes we can get just spontaneous insights from the substances, which is helpful, but I also wouldn't count on that. That I'm suddenly going to have, the ability to communicate in a way that I haven't before, where I want to check in verbally with this person about what we're going to do, or, so yeah, taking it slow and kind of, bringing in those new pieces, one at a time or something.
Right. Yeah. In this piece we were talking about consent, communicating with people, I think ideally in a sober state prior to the substances being used, especially if it's a new skill of like communicating your boundaries, communicating what you want and don't want to happen. In a sober state before adding in the variable of substances, I think can be a way to like be able to hold the experience when we come back to sobriety in a good way. And again, avoiding less regret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that makes me think about when we might change, we in a relationship field, maybe with ourselves too. But if there's an agreement before in a sober state, like whatever, I'm fine with fooling around, for example, the sexual situation, anything but, direct genital touch, for example. And then once we have ingested a substance, if that changes, I just find it interesting where we might become more open or less open. Like, actually, I don't even want to go that far, and respecting that, like, retraction. But if it's the opposite, actually, I feel more open. And that's what, there's crossover, there's connection and difference with what, in this professional work, and then like in general, just for any person, out there in the world, wanting to gain tools for safety and optimizing pleasure and health, where if we're saying, oh yeah, before that was a boundary, but now I feel more open because we're warmed up or we took this thing, where we might say, hey, let's just respect the previous consensual agreement when we were sober. But then when it's the opposite, hey, I actually don't even want to go that far. I want to do less. That, I'm just noticing, the difference in how these things get talked about as far as, because either way, I think we, it just because we have ingested something doesn't mean, at least from my experience, doesn't mean I'm not having access to my ability to consent to some degree, where I'm like, no, actually, I am checking in with myself, and I would rather do less, or I'd rather do more. And, so yeah. Right. Do you get what I'm saying?
I think so. And in terms of like, decision-making points, when that arises, when the original boundary that was named in sober state shifts when you're in a non-ordinary state, I think defaulting for sure to the more contained boundary, to not violate somebody else's experience, let's stick with that. Seems like a good protocol, right? But I think it gets, I think it gets a little confusing when it's like the boundary expands though, of like, oh, I started off here and now I'm more open. Right. Do you still, what's your thoughts on the decision-making process around that more expanded boundary?
Yeah.
That might have shifted.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, it's situationally dependent. You know, we're talking about you're sitting for someone on a journey and you're there just to hold space, whether you're a professional or this is your friend. Yeah. Defaulting to that previous agreement, is what ought to be, you know, just the MO. And then if it's like, oh, I'm with this person I actually have an established relationship with, I know them, we've already kind of explored these other realms to some degree. You know, I think it's, for me personally, it's situational.
Right. I think for myself, if I were in that situation, if the expanded boundary is kind of like in the zone of what I've already experienced with this person, then I'd feel more comfortable exploring the expanded boundary. But if it's like 2 steps beyond what I've ever done with this particular person, and this is reminding me of that conversation of repair and like situational and setting, like the situational context. If it's an expanded boundary, with somebody that I trust that I can have a reparative conversation with, that I trust that there's a certain level of resiliency in the relationship for us to kind of like navigate the newness of this escalated intimacy, then I'd be more likely to explore that. But I think it is a bit of a gray zone. And I think like the more attunement you have, the more you can stay in the present moment, the more, or rather the less you are attached you are to a particular course of action. I think for me, I get suspicious of any context where there's a strong attachment versus there's like a certain grasping of like, this needs to happen. If there's some energetic either within me or in the other person, it doesn't feel as safe. And I'm less likely to follow that path. Right. How does that land for you?
Yeah, I just think of our kind of the trauma healing awareness around choice. Like in general, choice, if you're feeling like you don't have choice or there's this pressure in any way, and coming from our own selves, or like, oh, we should do this because this is so romantic, or this is so like idyllic, or we said we would earlier, or whatever it is, like that lack of choicefulness is definitely not optimal. And should be, you know, just have to that mindfulness around. Yeah.
You know, we were talking about variables and like more variables, you want to kind of like slow down how many more variables you add to the mix. I also think some pieces that one might want to slow down is like how much escalation of the sexuality. And I think that's particularly important if there's a bit of a sexual trauma history in the field. Like I'm thinking of couples that might want to expand. Like there's been multiple occasions where it's like, oh, okay, a couple and they're wanting to try something new sexually and they're thinking threesome action, and want to like add substances to help kind of like make it a bit easier. And I'm like, let's slow that down, especially if there's like sexual trauma in the field or some other sort of trauma, relational trauma in the field. I think there's ways that you can slow down how much escalation there is, not just in the acts, and also the people. I think it's just helpful to be mindful of the possibility of some traumas emerging in the field, especially with psychedelics, because it helps us get more in contact with those subconscious elements of our memory systems. I think when there's multiple people in the field, and sexuality in the field, like the more primed we are in healthy communication, attuned boundaries, embodied self-awareness, tuning into our yeses and nos, like the more opportunity there is to have like a healing experience versus a re-traumatizing experience.
Yeah, definitely. A couple things came up for me with that, like epigenetics and this ancestral healing, where it's like, okay, even if you don't have any sort of, acute or otherwise specific sexual trauma, things can arise that come from our lineage. And I think that's hopefully becoming more like commonly known, but just to name that, like, sometimes things can happen and we might not even notice it. It was just like, oh, there was this kind of funny moment where it felt awkward, but I couldn't even name it. And it didn't even, so many things can happen. And I think of sex as an altered state in and of itself. For me, like this psychedelic realm was introduced, for me, like through sex without any substances, going into altered states. So sex in and of itself can be, for some of us, sometimes an altered state. And then, like if there was a couple, we want to have a threesome, with that example, practicing the communication, maybe practicing introducing the substances and the threesome, and doing those things separately and then combining them. Yeah. So
I think that's great.
Like that would be kind of like a recipe for optimizing success, optimizing pleasure. I mean, if the point is, it's for pleasure, as we all have the right to pursue, that's, unless you're very familiar, with that sort of thing, and it's just like, this is just something that you're casually doing, like, but if it's new, really breaking down those variables and introducing them one at a time is a general good rule of thumb.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. So if we were to summarize like key takeaways around how to avoid regret, in this sex and psychedelics context, maybe we could go back and forth. What would be some of our key, like, hey, don't forget this pieces?
I'm kind of reframing some of it, but I just think about, those tools, like what are the tools? If you've experienced regret in the past, what are those lessons, we can glean from those experiences, and bringing in compassion, so that we're not ruminating. And I feel like with the rumination piece, really acknowledging we're in a social context and that our socialization might have taught us certain things, that we should feel bad about something or, whatever. And that, just bringing in that wider context, around how we might have been taught around these things too.
Right. So if we're talking about, how to avoid regret, I think what you're saying is acknowledging some of the imprinted conditioning that got put into our system from sex negative cultural contexts, psychedelics negative, substances negative cultural contexts, and like not necessarily like watching out for identifying with them.
Yeah.
So we don't get spun in this like regretful state where we're resisting our choices rather from that lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that might not always be relevant, but in general, we're all operating in a context. So I think it can be easy to get, just in our own heads, like with these sort of things. And so just offering that wider perspective.
Right. Yeah. So being mindful of like the scripts and stories we're carrying, and maybe differentiating and finding our own truth in relationship from those stories is an important piece for avoiding getting lost in regret. That piece around repair, I think, is also important, and like setting up this context, I think. So it's more repair likely. So connecting, experiencing sex and psychedelics in a relational context where there is an understanding, tool set, intention for repair. Tap in if we need to go there. But that there's enough familiarity and connection to be able to hold the possibility of going beyond our boundaries in those contexts.
Yeah. That relational awareness. Yeah. And I think I just want to touch on, that relational aspect, like even just being witnessed, like, okay, if you're feeling regret or you're experiencing extreme regret, what would it be like for someone to hold that compassionately? If you're feeling isolated around that, and maybe it's not necessary to have feedback, but to just be witness, like I'm having this experience, and just being witness in that can be extremely powerful. And also bringing it back to the somatics, and whoever's listening to this, noticing like, what does that feel like in the body? Like, how does regret actually show up? And so if you are experiencing it, or you can pull a memory where you had regret, especially, or maybe if you're on your own, just like a manageable situation that wouldn't be overwhelming to your nervous system, but feeling like, how does that show up for you? What is the actual experience of regret feel like to you in your body? Any other thoughts, memories or physical sensations or impulses that come with that, and bringing in that non-judgmental, just somatic perspective, so that you can actually get to know regret. And that way it might be easier to avoid regret when you actually get to know it on that level.
I like that. Yeah. That quality feels like self-repair, that what you just kind of outlined there, that practice of being more mindful, compassionate, aware, inclusive of this experience of regret, getting to know it more intimately, from that mindful self-acceptance space, feels like there's a certain level of self-repair as well. But I also appreciate wanting to be witnessed through the lens of others. And I think you are offering a psychedelic integration circle in Santa Cruz, and we can talk more about that at the end of our podcast. And I also offer spaces where I support people in that integration and witnessing space.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for this conversation, and I feel like this is integrating, to talk about this. And I know we both share some years of background around these subjects, and personally and professionally, and to be having this candid conversation with each other that's kind of bridging worlds in a way, I feel like, where we can share, our personal experiences. And so I'm just really grateful.
Yeah, likewise. Okay. Listeners, I'm so glad you joined us in this conversation. I hope you had some beautiful takeaways. I think the big one for me is the whole variable element. Just like one variable at a time, exploring the combination of sexuality and psychedelics from a place of wonder, like maybe expanding the boundaries a little bit of your normal everyday reality, but trying not to like overwhelm your system. So you can be more mindful of the impact of each one of these variables and find your way back to ground in a good way. And so there's not like a huge gap between your everyday reality and what you're experiencing. So it makes it makes integration much more possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. All right, Annie. Before we transition, is there anything you want to tell the audience about what you're up to, how they can find you?
Yeah, well, my website is Lovage, Lovage, somatics.com. And Lorina, you already plugged our group coming up. February 15th will be the first, and I think we might start off with meeting once a month for that professional peer supervision group.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're in the Monterey Bay or Santa Cruz area, every Monday I'm hosting with a colleague of mine, Craig Beeson, a Psychedelic Integration Circle. And if you're interested in that, you can just contact me directly, and maybe we'll have the...
we'll have all the links and contact information.
Website too. If you're interested in that, I'll send you the location details.
All right. Thank you so much, Annie. I'm so glad we get to co-create together, and glad we get to geek out with a larger field of listening, and hopefully we get to support people in avoiding regret, or at least making repair, and learning from their experiences in these realms of sexuality and psychedelics. All right.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.